tobacco. Then a tribute to retiring Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell by House lawmakers. And that's the C-SPAN 2 program schedule. Next, a debate between candidates running for governor in Kansas. Republican candidate Bill Graves, Kansas's Secretary of State, faced Democratic Representative Jim Slattery. The current governor of Kansas, Joan Finney, has decided not to run for re-election. This debate was held Monday in Wichita, Kansas, sponsored by the Wichita Independent Business Association. It runs about an hour.
Good evening and welcome to this gubernatorial candidate forum with Democratic Congressman Jim Slattery and Republican Secretary of State Bill Graves. I am Rollin Smith, Executive Director of the Wichita Independent Business Association, and will serve as moderator for this program. This forum is sponsored by the Wichita Independent Business Association, an association of locally owned businesses in the Wichita trade area. The association was started in 1931. It is our desire to become better informed by asking these candidates questions of importance to small business in Kansas so we can vote more intelligently. Many people do not know that 96% of all the businesses in Kansas have fewer than 50 employees. 89% have fewer than 20, and 77% have fewer than 10. It is estimated that these businesses employ close to 60% of all the employees in Kansas. Therefore, it is vital for these businesses to know how each candidate stands on small business issues before they vote. We welcome Jim Slattery and Bill Graves to this forum and want to express our thanks and appreciation to them for working into their very busy schedules. Also, we'd like to express our thanks to Multimedia Cablevision for broadcasting this live on Channel 33 as a public service, and to Johnson's Garden Centers providing the plants and greenery decorating the stage. There has already been a large number of gubernatorial candidate forums in this campaign, and even more are scheduled before the election. There are three very important issues that the candidates have repeatedly explained their positions on publicly numerous times and have been reported in depth by the various media. Therefore, our questions and hopefully comments by the candidates will not be repeated in this forum concerning these three issues. They are crime prevention, welfare reform, and school finance. In no way are we implying that these are not important issues to be considered in electing our next governor, because they certainly are. Unfortunately, time will not allow us to ask all the questions we would like to, but we have chosen 6 questions of specific interest to small business beyond those 3 major issues. Our discussion will be limited to the 6 questions in this forum. Also, each question will be prefaced by a short statement of concern that will set the stage for why the question is being asked. Each question will be asked by an owner or an executive from a WIBA member business. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond. The candidates have not seen the questions prior to this program and only were alerted as to the general subject areas they would come from. Those on my panel on my left asking the questions are in order from your left to right. Number 1 is Lynn Bird, owner of Wichita Stamp and Seal. Then number 2 is Ray Henderleiter, president and owner of Power Chemicals, Inc. Number 3 is Pat Finn, owner of Finn & Associates and 1994 president of WIBA. Number 4 is Cleo Littleton, owner of Litco, Inc., a contractor. Number 5 is Tom Steele, an attorney with Rupin Gerard Law Offices and chairman of the WIBA State Government Affairs Committee that was responsible for organizing this forum. And number 6 is Bob Sudbury, owner of Sudbury Transportation, a trucking company. After these opening moments, each candidate will be given 5 minutes each to make their opening statements before beginning with the questions. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to the question. A timer will be signaling them of maintaining time on each question so we can stay on schedule. After the questions are completed, each candidate will have 3 minutes to make concluding statements, after which I will close the program. Opening statements will be started by Bill Graves, and question 1 will start with Jim Slattery and continue alternating that way through the rest of the program. Now we have the opening statement by candidate Bill Graves.
Roland, thank you very much, and to the panelists and to all of you for coming out tonight. We appreciate your interest in this year's very important gubernatorial race. I do want to thank the Wichita Independent Business Association for putting this together. I am certainly honored to be the Republican nominee for governor, and I'm going to work very hard over the next 5 weeks to try to earn the trust of the people of Kansas and certainly their votes on November 8th. I've been a fan for many years of the great Yogi Berra, and he once said, if you don't know where you're going, you're probably going to end up somewhere else. So with that little thought in mind, I want to tell you where it is I think I see Kansas going. And while I recognize that we are shying away from 3 very important subjects, let me at least acknowledge at the outset that number 1, crime is of great importance to us in this state. It is critical that we develop a multidimensional effort to deal with crime, cooperating with the federal government, city and county officials. It is clear that there needs to be greater emphasis in our state on juveniles who are committing crimes, and as governor, I'm very serious about being an active participant in making sure we improve the quality of life in Kansas relative to crime. Let me say about school finance, because it is so critical to our future in many, many ways and has direct ties into the economic vitality of this state in terms of the training that takes place in our young people, the future workers in our state. We need to deal with school finance. It's a very difficult, complex question. I'm willing to sit down with legislative leaders, with leaders in school finance and education in our state, and try to craft a new formula given the outcome of the recent court case. But I will say this, I think it's absolutely critical that it does get resolved, because we spend too much time focused on how we fund education and probably not enough time on the final product of our education system. Public education is so critical to our future that we must get the financing question behind us and move on to insisting on quality education for all Kansas children. And finally, I'll mention briefly welfare reform. We did pass a series of initiatives in the last legislative session. I think they're very fine, well thought out initiatives, but now we need to make the rubber meet the road. Within the Department of SRS, we've got to make sure that we do insist upon breaking the generation after generation reliance upon welfare and assistance. It's important that we do that for your sake as taxpayers of this state, but it's also important that we do it for the sake of those people who are recipients of those welfare benefits, because we have to insist on and encourage them to develop that sense of self-reliance and self-esteem. Speaking for just a moment on health care, I don't know that we should count on federal solutions in any way, shape, or form to the health care dilemma that we now face. Clearly, the next governor of Kansas, working with the legislature, is going to be at the forefront of dealing with health care problems. I think there are 3 areas that we clearly have to encourage in that debate. The first is a reform of our tort system. I think medical malpractice and the costs that are derived from the defensive medicine that's practiced has to be a continued area of emphasis for us as we shape new public policy. I think we have to highlight developments in telemedicine, which has such great potential to reach out to underserved areas throughout the state of Kansas. And I think finally, we do need to continue the reasonable, incremental approach that we've taken over many years in Kansas. Areas in the past legislative session, like changes in insurance laws relative to portability and pre-existing conditions. And we did make a change in the definition of the small employer groups to make those groups larger in terms of negotiating better prices on health insurance coverage. That's the direction that Kansas needs to go. I tell you those 4 things, though, in setting the framework for what the real problem is. And the real problem is state spending. We have seen the state budget double in the last 8 years from $3.6 billion to $7.2 billion. If we are going to effectively invest the resources we need in crime, in health care reform, in school finance, in welfare reform, it's going to be critical that we do a better job of controlling state spending. And there has been a time, and every politician who's come down the pike has said, I'm going to be the one that gets tough on state spending. Well, I will tell you, I think the day of reckoning is there, because we cannot rely upon or expect the federal government to bail us out, and we must insist that we not have unfunded mandates from any level to any other level. So I believe that the state has to finally live within its means and do a better job of setting priorities. And that's not to say that there's not still some waste, but there are a lot of things we do at the state level which I believe we need to more carefully analyze and look to eliminate some things that are just not up there high on our priority list as Kansans. I've had the pleasure of being Secretary of State for the last 8 years. I've enjoyed a chance to run an efficient and an effective agency that serves the business community of this state, and I'm certainly anxious as Governor to continue that level of service for the next 4 years. Thank you all very much.
Roland, thank you very much for organizing this event this evening, and it's a pleasure to be here with the Wichita Independent Business Association, and I really relish these opportunities to get together and chat about the future of Kansas. First, let me say that from my perspective, Kansas taxpayers are taxed to the max. And the reason I say that is because I'm absolutely convinced that the people of this state don't want any more taxes. So what we're going to have to do to generate the resources that our state will so desperately need to deal with the problems of crime and education and health care is to grow the economy. And here this evening I hope we can focus on just how the two of us propose to grow the economy of this state. And when I contemplate growing the economy, I think it's important for us to focus on really what government's role is in doing this. I know there's a great sense of cynicism in the land today about government and what government can or cannot do or what government should do. But in some areas, the government has a very important role to play. And certainly in the area of community safety, the people of this state have a right to expect their communities to be safe. The government has an important role to play there, and the government isn't doing that as effectively as it must. And one of the things I would just observe is that if we really want to talk about revitalizing our communities and growing our economy, we have to start in some of our economically depressed communities. And there, if we could just stabilize real estate values, it would have a profound effect on the wealth of those communities. Just think about this. If a $30,000 house went up in value 4% a year, instead of it going down in value 4% a year, the difference would be about $200 a month in the pockets of the owners of that home. I talked to a business leader here in Wichita, and I asked him, I said, what's the most important thing we can do to help you grow your business here in Wichita? And you know what he told me? He said, make the community safer. So when we talk about the economic future of this state, we have to be focused on making our communities safer. It's a very important responsibility of government. I've put together a 20-point plan that the Fraternal Order of Police looked at and said, this is something that's affordable, it's achievable, it's real, and they decided to do something they have never done before. And that is endorse a candidate for governor. And they decided to endorse the Slattery Sater ticket. And I appreciate that endorsement. The other area that the government has a key role to play in is in the area of education. Today in Kansas, nearly 60% of the employers claim that they struggle to find employees with the skills that they need to fill the jobs that they have. 60%. That tells me we're not doing what we must and should to connect better all of our educational institutions with real employers. So let's get more good school-to-work programs that connect our high schools, our vocational technical schools, our community colleges, and our Board of Regents institutions with real employers. We're going to have to restructure the delivery of education in this state to assure that our children and our future workers have the technical skills that they will need to fill the jobs that will be available in the year 2000. And we're not doing as much of that as we must. Tax stability is another very important role that the government plays. And I say this as someone who is a small business person. I started a business in Topeka in the real estate area, and I can tell you that during the 1980s, I got hammered by the tax law changes in this state. Hammered. And I learned painfully the importance of tax stability when you start talking about planning and expanding a business. That's why I've said let's remove the sales tax on new construction. And when we get the resources, let's remove the sales tax on utilities and manufacturing to make our state more competitive in attracting good manufacturing jobs. I've also said that I'll veto any attempt to impose the sales tax on services in this state. And I know that we have problems with our property valuation department as it is interacting with business in the assessment of personal property at the business level. And that's something that we have to focus on also. The other area that we have to really work on is reducing the regulatory burdens on business. And there's some things we can do there that won't cost any money and will in fact generate resources in the state, like passage of the recent product liability reform legislation that I co-sponsored with Congressman Glickman. It took us 8 years to slug that bill through the Congress. But what it means is at least 1,000 jobs, if not 1,500 jobs, good-paying jobs for Kansas. And as governor of this state, I want to continue to work to reduce the regulatory burden and to make this state a more business-friendly environment, because I know that's what has to be done to create good-paying jobs in this state. In conclusion, let me just say that between the two of us, there's one business person here who has had the responsibility of meeting a payroll. I started a business, borrowed money to do it, created jobs, and have felt that pressure of meeting a payroll. My opponent has not had such a business experience. That's a very important difference that I think you all should consider as you make your decision as to who you're going to vote for governor this fall. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lynn Byrd will ask the first question.
We believe that state spending is out of control and greatly exceeds the rate of inflation. Most Kansans, and especially business owners from the small business community, are concerned about the rapid growth in government and with the continually rising cost of Kansas state government. It is sad and unfortunate that Kansas state government spending growth continues to exceed the rate of inflation and the rate of growth in personal income in Kansas. At recent forums, both of you have stated you would not support a lid on state spending, but would do your best to hold down the spending. We would like you to be more specific. For example, there was a proposed constitutional amendment last session, and it will be introduced again this coming session, stating that the growth in spending by state government cannot exceed the rate of growth in personal income in Kansas. Our question is this: will you support this proposed constitutional amendment? If not, what specific alternative measures do you propose to control state spending?
Well, first of all, I am not prepared to endorse a constitutional amendment limiting state spending as you have suggested. I would certainly support a statutory limit on state spending, and I've indicated that. Now let me talk specifically about some things that we can do to control state spending. I've advocated an aggregate cap, a cap on the total number of full-time state employees. That's something that we can do, and I think that we can live with it. During the Carlin years, the number of state employees actually declined. And I think that over the next 4 years, the next governor is going to have to be very careful in hiring additional state employees. So I am convinced that we can live with a cap on the number of state employees. I also have said that if elected governor, I'm going to appoint a grace-type commission with an inspector general to look at all areas of the state budget to find any waste that we can possibly find. I also believe that we need to competitively bid professional services for our state. There's all kinds of rascality going on in state government where political cronies pass out business to their buddies and to legislators without a competitive bid. And if I'm elected governor, that's going to stop. In addition to that, I will tell you that I have a reputation as being tough on spending. The Washington Post, the New York Times has called me a deficit hawk, because I worked to terminate funding for the B-2 and the Super Collider and to reform entitlements and to cut the Lawrence Welk House and a few other things. I saved the taxpayers about $50 billion, and I'm proud of that label of being someone who is called a deficit hawk. I also think that there's significant savings that we can realize within the Department of Social and Rehabilitation Services. And I don't know exactly how much, but some of the people that I've talked to think that it's in the 20% range. I think that's maybe a little high, but I think there's some savings that can be realized there. So these are some of the things that I think we can and must do in the next few years to get state spending under control.
Thank you, Lynn. I appreciate the question. I was concerned when I announced for governor in October of last year. One of the planks in that announcement was a support of a constitutional cap on spending. So when I read that at recent forums I stated I haven't supported, I hope it's not in print anywhere. I'll get in trouble again for that. I have been in favor of a constitutional cap on spending. I think that we do need to interject some form of discipline into the legislative process because clearly it has been tough to control spending, and this is over several administrations, and so I think it's a great tool. I will say this, though, if we are unable to accomplish that, the governor certainly has a very real way to control spending, and that's called the veto. And I certainly pledge to you, if I have the opportunity, I will use the veto in making sure we control state spending. I do want to say that there are additional things that we can do. I certainly think that there are a number of patronage jobs which report to the governor. They are appointive positions that I think that in many cases are there not so much to be of service to you as taxpayers of Kansas, but to be there to be available for the governor to hand out to whomever it might be. And I think we can eliminate, we'll find we can eliminate some of those jobs and control some spending. We have an excellent Senate subcommittee working on areas in privatization, which I concur with. I think privatization is one way that government can get out of certain businesses and return some of that work to the private sector. And I certainly think that the Reinventing Government group that's working right now also has come up with some interesting ideas for us, but it's not surprising that at every turn the bureaucracy seems to say, well, we understand what your suggestion is, but we're having a hard time getting that implemented. And so what we need to do is have a governor who's really committed to making sure that we run state government as efficiently and as effectively as we can. I like to use the example, and you may remember when Governor Finney was upset about her son not passing his driver's license examination, and he went into the station and, and kind of raised heck with the employees. I'm not sure that's a good example of how you use gubernatorial power, but it raises an interesting point about how a governor can truly influence the performance of state employees, and I'm committed to doing that.
Thank you. Question number 2 comes from Ray Hinderleiter.
My question concerns the personal property tax and what we call the witch hunt audits that are being conducted by the Department of Revenue. The present administration in Topeka avoided asking for a general tax increase and did not want to cut expenditures, and they did this by allowing the Kansas Department of Revenue to creatively define the Kansas tax code, and this is causing havoc to many business operations. Unfortunately, these new unprecedented tax interpretations are being applied retroactively. As a result, many businesses are having to reevaluate the advantages of even being located in Kansas. Much of this can be remedied by the new governor's philosophy and by the people he appoints to serve in the Kansas Department of Revenue. My question is this: are you willing, if elected governor, to review with us the serious problems we are facing and experiencing in these areas and appoint persons that will be more realistic in interpreting the laws and develop specific guidelines to halt the current expansive and retroactive interpretation of the statutes and other abusive decisions by the Department of Revenue?
Well, Ray, thank you. Of course, the answer is obviously yes, especially when at the part of the question where you ask if we review with you those things. And clearly, WIBA played a role in '93 in our workers' comp reform effort, and we would certainly enjoy the input of this group in any discussions relative to personal property taxes. I also think one of the key words in the question is appoint persons. And I have often pointed out that regulations just don't appear by themselves. Regulatory burden is not something that just happens without some person behind it. I think clearly regulatory burden is a reflection of the kind of people who have been selected to be involved in the operation of state agencies. And again, we clearly need people in state government who understand their purpose in being there is serving the businesses and the citizens of this state and not necessarily perpetuating their own existence. I'm certainly aware of the situation in Leavenworth, and we found out that the people hired in Leavenworth weren't qualified to do business in Kansas, and so we wrote them a letter and said they probably ought to check with the Secretary of State and make sure they were qualified to be here before they went out on those witch hunt audits. It didn't do a lot of good, but it was at least one little thing that we could do. I'm certainly willing to sit down and work with you all, and I don't know to what extent there's any compromise available on some sort of a threshold for a definition of the personal property that is subject to taxation. Obviously, there's a balancing act that has to be done with county officials who are depending upon a revenue stream to support their efforts. But I certainly think that it is time that we as a state government stop the adversarial relationship that exists between the Property Valuation Division and the Department of Revenue with the citizens of this state. We obviously need state revenues, county revenues to perform critical functions of government, but at the same time there has to be a better level of communication and cooperative spirit so that we can resolve problems instead of perpetuating more problems.
The short answer to your question is yes, I'll be more than happy to work with you. And I have spent some time in the Department of Revenue a number of years ago. A few months I was a Secretary of Revenue, so I understand a little bit about that department. And the key to making the Department of Revenue work is to have good people there that understand the law, that have common sense, that have had some business experience. And I recognize and understand this problem that you all have with the Property Valuation Department coming out and assessing personal property in the commercial and business environments. And from my standpoint, I think perhaps the easiest way and the most sensible way to deal with this would be to establish some threshold for personal property so that personal property below that threshold, whether it's $1,000 or whatever it is, would not be subject to personal property taxes. That may be a way to look at this, and I'm studying that right now. But the idea of requiring businesses to go out and in effect count up their boxes of paper clips in their supply cabinets just makes no sense to me. And as a former businessman, I mean, I have been through some of these hassles myself. And I know what you all are dealing with, and that's the kind of thing that I think we should be committed to changing. Let me, if I can, use the remaining time that I have on this question to make a point about state spending in general, because we talk about it in sort of broad terms, but the three areas where you have state spending increasing so much are in Medicaid, education, and highways. And if in the future we want a highway program, we better be prepared to pay for it. And the problem we have in the area of education, of course, is dealing with the court decisions, and that's going to drive the legislature's decision in the area of school finance in the next session. And then Medicaid. And the problem we have within Medicaid is the sharp increase in the cost of nursing home care coupled with uncompensated care of health care for people that don't have health insurance. Those are the three areas of the state budget that you're seeing sharp increases in. And when we talk about getting spending under control at the state level, we have to focus on those three areas of the state budget. And those are very tough areas. And time is up, or I would talk to you about how I think that can be done. Okay.
Question number 3 is from Pat Finn, and probably our most lengthiest commentary, but stick with us because it is an important question. Pat?
My topic deals with health care reform in Kansas. Unfortunately tonight, we only have time to address one small part of the problem in our question to you. High costs have made health care coverage not affordable or has caused an extra heavy burden on many small businesses in Kansas. Price controls are not the answer, as we believe in a free market system and oppose federal or state mandates. There are large Medicare and Medicaid discounts, non-insured costs, and large business discounts that cause a severe shifting of costs to insured small businesses and individuals who are forced to make up the difference in high premium rates they have to pay. WIBA currently sponsors a health care plan with 400 participating member businesses that makes health care available to many member businesses with between 1 and 25 employees. But we still lack real bargaining power to lower premiums because we do not have a large enough pool of people enrolled in the plans to have the necessary leverage. Unfortunately, recent health care insurance legislation in Kansas has done little, especially for the self-employed and especially businesses with less than 3 employees, which make up an estimated 50% or more of the businesses in Kansas. WIBA has a concern for these businesses because they make up a large portion of WIBA membership and jobs in Kansas. Our question is, as governor, will you support legislative changes that would allow small businesses and/or business associations to band together and form larger volunteer purchasing alliances or cooperatives in order to receive more competitive rates on group health care plans?
Yes. This is something I've worked on for a number of years at the federal level, and regrettably the federal government isn't going to act in this area. But I introduced with Senator Benson some of the original insurance reform legislation several years ago, and it should have been enacted, and we fought to do it, just haven't gotten it done because of attempts made in the Senate to kill this legislation. But let's talk specifically about what can be done. We do need to do more in the area of pre-existing conditions. I am tired of running into Kansans every day that are paying $1,000 a month for health insurance benefits because they have a child that has a diabetic condition. That can be changed. Let's move toward a community-rated type system, a modified community-rated system. Let's make our health insurance benefits portable so that when people move from job A to job B, they know they'll be able to get health insurance there. And yes, I do favor and have long favored the establishment of purchasing type cooperatives that will enable small businesses and individuals to band together and purchase their insurance in the marketplace collectively so that they can have the same kind of buying power that our largest employers have. These are the kind of things that can be done, I believe, that won't cost any money, any taxpayers' money, but will move us in a giant step toward making our health insurance system more equitable and just and more affordable. Now, the tough area here in the healthcare delivery system is what we can and must do to make health insurance available and affordable for low-income working people. That group in our society that are playing by the rules, working hard every day, making maybe $7.50 an hour, and don't have health insurance at their place of employment. If a child gets sick in that family, those people have to go on welfare to get health care. And the net effect is today in Kansas, about 25% of the people on welfare are there to get health care. And I hope that there's one thing we can all agree upon is the need for us to change that. And as governor, I'm going to be doing everything I can to address that problem. I see it as one of the biggest problems in our healthcare delivery system. But all the other insurance reforms that I just talked about, I've been working to pass at the federal level and will work to pass at the state level. I think it's very important.
Pat, clearly the legislature created an oversight panel to observe changes in federal law. And now that debate is somewhat over in Washington, it's clear that that group needs to be expanded so we can include representatives from groups like WIBA, consumers, also people who deliver health care services to try to craft new policies that are beneficial to the people of this state. I too think the answer is yes. Clearly we made an attempt in the last legislative session to expand the size of the pool, but the expansion really was more upward as opposed to looking at very, very small employers with 3 or less employees. So I believe that our state has sent a signal that we're willing to look at allowing pooling arrangements to take place. But now what we've got to do is focus on the very small employers and make sure they have some opportunity to be involved in that level as well. I think it's important for the state to recognize, as your question so aptly states, the number of small businesses in Kansas who are struggling to deal with the problem of health care and taking care of their employees. I do not support employer mandates with regard to health care, but I do believe that we have to come up with creative, innovative options to allow some types of arrangements where the employee can purchase through the pool or the employer through the pool on behalf of their people.
The next question will come from Cleo Littleton.
My concern is workers' compensation. The Kansas legislature revised the State Workers' Compensation Act last year. Injured employees who have permanent injuries are allowed to recover compensations for their physical impairment. Also, the injured employees can recover more than their physical impairment if he or she has what is called work disability. Last year, Kansas legislation redefined the definition of work disability so that an injured employee has an automatic 50% award if the injury employed is not working for anyone at the time the work compensation claim is decided by the administration law judge. Our question is, do you support a change in the Workers' Compensation Act so that work disability is based on the injured employee's ability to earn wages rather than the lack of the actual post-injury wages?
Cleo, I'm going to give the honest answer at the outset, and that is that it's a complicated question, and I'm not sure. I think that there is still room within workers' comp reform so that we can do some things that benefit employers in our state without harming or denying employees rights to receive appropriate compensation. But I cannot tell you if on that particular question I'm not prepared to give a yes or no answer. Let me say this. I think that the changes we made in the 93 session have been beneficial. We've seen some relief already in terms of the increase in workers' compensation insurance premiums. We have other terms that we are struggling with. The definition of on-the-job injury is another term that there needs to be ongoing discussion, an attempt made to bring more sense to it and how it is administered. But I think at this point in time, rather than make a yes or no answer. I'll just say it is certainly an issue that the governor and the legislature, and again WIBA, who was so involved in '93, are going to sit down and talk about, because we, in spite of the successes we've had, we've now got to continue to move forward, because if sure as we don't continue the same effort that occurred in '93, we will start to backtrack very shortly.
I have indicated that we should allow the changes that the last session of the legislature made to work for a period of time to see exactly where we are. Based on the information I have, the changes that were made by the '93 legislature are saving businesses in this state millions of dollars. And I've indicated that I don't want any additional changes there until we see exactly where we're headed. Now, there are some things in this area that we can and should be doing. We should make sure that we have an insurance commissioner that is really actively and aggressively regulating and monitoring our insurance companies in this state. Point number one. And hopefully we'll get a new insurance commissioner that will be a much more vigorous advocate for consumers in the health care and in the workers' compensation insurance markets. In addition to that, I think it's very important for us to do a good job of enforcing the fraud and abuse provisions of the new law. And I think we all agree that if people are fraudulently taking advantage of the system, they should be punished for that. But we also have to make sure that this system works as it is historically designed and intended to work, and that is to adequately compensate our workers for the injuries that they sustain at their place of employment. And I'm committed to making sure that whatever we do doesn't mess that up. And the last point I want to make in this area is that we have also got to act decisively to make sure that we don't see or read about any more lawyers or state officials taking advantage of this workers' compensation system as we've seen in the last few years. It is a bloody outrage, and it sends exactly the wrong signals to everybody in the system. And if I'm elected governor, I want to tighten this up so those kind of things just don't happen anymore.
The next question will be presented by Tom Steele.
My question concerns tax referendums. Currently, Kansas taxpayers are empowered with deciding bond issues, and if a successful petition drive is held, on certain local property tax referendums, like the local option budgets. In Colorado, tax referendums are automatic on all state and local tax hikes. In Missouri, they're automatic for all local tax hikes. And in Oklahoma, the legislature can either hold a state tax referendum or can increase taxes only by a supermajority of 2/3 or greater majority vote of the legislature. Our question is, do you support empowering voters through the expansion of tax referendums?
Okay. Under existing law in Kansas, with the property tax lid, which I have historically supported when I was in the legislature during the docking days, I was a strong supporter of the property tax lid, and I am to this day. And the provisions in the property tax lid that allow for local protest petitions, I think makes sense. And I've always supported that. I also believe that even under the school finance law, with our local option budget authority, local school boards can make a decision as to whether to increase local property taxes to pay for school finance, and the taxpayers have the right then to protest that, and if there's adequate protest, then it can be subject to a vote of the people. That kind of mechanism, I think, is workable, and that's the kind of mechanism that I support.
Tom, the answer is no. As I said earlier, I support a constitutional cap on spending. I think that that's the direction that we should go, is to come up with a reasonable cap that's tied to the growth in personal incomes in Kansas. And I believe that if we could be successful in doing that, we would go a long way towards controlling the legislature's propensity to simply continue spending beyond the growth in the incomes of the very taxpayers who support them. Certainly, in a sort of a simplistic way, you have an opportunity as a voter to protest anything your legislator does with regard to raising taxes or on votes on any issue every time you go to the polls in the primary and the general election. So I am very much in favor of the constitutional cap on spending, but do not support the referendum.
Thank you. The next question will be from Bob Sudbury.
We need a state definition of independent subcontractors. Currently, the state definition is very ambiguous concerning who is and who is not an independent subcontractor in Kansas. When these notorious 20 common law factors are invoked by the state, they are interpreted in a highly subjective and arbitrary manner. There is no clear-cut state legislation or regulation defining who is an independent subcontractor in Kansas. This uncertainty increases cost, risk, frustration, and legal fees for businesses that are traditionally dependent on subcontractors. This is important to us, as there are a number of WEBA members that are independent subcontractors, and many other WEBA member businesses that use independent subcontractors. So my question is, as governor, would you seek to have the state generate specific rules to resolve this chronic and troublesome issue?
Bob, absolutely. In fact, I'm sure it doesn't take on the same degree of the magnitude that you all deal with as business people, but one of the frustrations we've had in the agency, the Secretary of State's office, has been over the definition of the term residency, which if you look throughout the statutes in Kansas, you'll find many, many different references to what residency is, and we're always dealing with that every time an election rolls around. So I think, again, it ties back to people, because we're talking about communication and cooperation between the people at Human Resources, between the Department of Revenue, and maybe more a fundamental question of common sense. What is government's role? What is it we should be trying to accomplish? And clearly we should be working hard every day to cut through the regulatory burden, the disinformation, misinformation that we send to people who are out there trying to make it every day in the business world. And I think as clearly as governor, I'm going to sit down and insist that my cabinet level people set a tone for how we want to see state government operate, and we want to sit down and create an environment where there is not this kind of back and forth where you don't know from day in to day out how the interpretation of the subcontractor is going to be determined by state government.
Well, in my business, I dealt with this situation personally. I was in the real estate world, and we were at one time faced with this question of whether our sales associates were going to be independent contractors or employees. And I know personally the kind of problem that you're talking about, because it took us a number of months to get a clear answer, and when we got the answer, we weren't sure it was the right answer, and if it wasn't the right answer, the potential of paying FICA and other back taxes was pretty significant. So I understand the need for this kind of change, and that's why I'll work with the business community to clarify it. But let me also take this to the next level, and that is, it is very important how this be done, because if the business community starts trying to identify everybody it possibly can as an independent contractor, the base upon which unemployment insurance taxes are paid, workers' compensation taxes are paid, health care benefits are provided, will shrink. And we all know there's enormous pressure on business to move in that direction nowadays. And I think we have to be very sensible and cautious in how we do this, so that we don't get into a situation where you have fewer and fewer employers and employees contributing to workers' comp, unemployment insurance, and health care. That could be a very destructive downward cycle too. So this has truly got to be a definition that is rooted in the historic understanding of what an independent contractor is. And I just want to make that point to balance this out, because I see that as being a very dangerous situation to get into that could be very harmful to a lot of employees that today are truly in an employee relationship. And we better be careful that we don't define all of them as independent contractors. I think that could be a very dangerous thing to start doing.
This is a unique situation where candidates have actually given up time. They had time left. So I am going to extend to you a 6-minute closing instead of 3 for each one of you, so that you may be able to talk a little more on some of the other areas that you would like to, and that will still give us within our time frame. So, Mr. Slattery.
Okay, well, first of all, let me thank you again for the opportunity to be here this evening and to participate in this forum. I happen to believe very strongly that the next governor of this state needs to be someone who has had experience in agriculture, which I have. I spent the first 20 years of my life on our family farm in the Good Intent community in Atchison County. My brother continues to farm it. I understand agriculture. I've worked in it. My opponent has not had that experience, and that's a difference worth considering. I've already pointed out to you that contrary to the illusion that's been created by some of my opponent's very artfully done high and tight commercials, the fact of the matter is he has little or no business experience. He's never had the pressure of borrowing money and creating jobs and meeting a payroll. I have, and that's another difference worth considering. I also believe that the next governor of this state needs to be someone who has been tested in the tough battles. I've had to cast tough votes, those kind of votes that you put the evidence on the scale and it's 51-49. My opponent has never had to cast a tough vote. And the other thing I think is important is we need a governor who has been through some of the difficult legislative battles in negotiating these very complex issues. And I've been in that arena. And I've been bloodied and scarred up a little bit because I've been there. But that experience, I think, is critically important. That's an experience I have, which my opponent does not have either. And my opponent says that he ran an office high and tight. Well, I looked at the numbers, and guess what I found? The 4% increase that he's bragging about is sort of a clever manipulation of the figures. The fact of the matter is, if you look at his first fiscal year in office and compare it to his last fiscal year in office, his budget went up about 30%. So, Bill, you're being a little low and loose with the facts, I guess, in your high and tight commercials. But the point of the matter is, when you look at my budget, I've been able to return to the federal government $750,000 over the time that I've been in office. And every year I've returned money that was allocated to my office, and it ranged from 5% to 18%. Now just think how much better off our government would be today if all the agencies of government had run a real high and tight operation, as I have done in my office. And I think that I learned that in the business world. And as governor of this state, I'm going to apply those lessons to reducing our state budget. We've talked about some of those here today. And I want to make sure that we do everything possible to make our communities safer. And we've talked a little bit about that. But I want to just tell you that one of the things we have to do in this area is to reform our juvenile justice system. Our juvenile justice system is in the ditch. It's a revolving door. And the juveniles across this state understand that very clearly. We release dangerous juveniles on weekend passes from the youth center at Topeka, for example, that have committed murder. And these kind of things, I think, should stop. I think we should be committed to keeping violent people off our streets, regardless of their age, as long as possible, until they're prepared to return and be peaceful members of society. And yes, I want to take the nonviolent people back into the community, keep them in community corrections. Yes, get them in orange jumpsuits and get them involved in doing something constructive to repay their victims in the community and to repay the community that they have injured. So as long as there's a piece of trash to pick up in Sedgwick County, we ought to have these people out there working instead of sitting in air-conditioned jails someplace. I'm going to be as tough as I can in the area of crime. And I understand that over the long term we have to also focus on crime prevention. And that gets us into a lot of things like teen pregnancy prevention programs and substance and alcohol abuse programs. I understand that, and it's a very comprehensive effort that we have to focus on. We've talked a little bit about health care. And one of the things I want to remind you of is that this last year I took a lot of heat because I opposed some provisions of the Clinton health care plan on employer mandates. I did so because at that time I was convinced that the kind of employer mandates that were being recommended would have been harmful to small business in this state, especially those businesses involved in manufacturing and competing in the international marketplace. And I'll tell you something though, as governor of this state, I want to work with the business community and the healthcare delivery system in this state to put together a program that will enable us to provide some kind of basic health care to these low-income working people that we're pushing onto welfare when they need health care. We have to deal with that problem, I believe. The last thing I want to touch on is the need for us to make sure that we train the next generation of workers in this state. And the state government has a very important responsibility and role to play in this area. And as I said earlier, today we have a situation where nearly 60% of our employers are saying we're not doing the job we must of connecting our educational system to our employers. When 60% of our employers are saying, I'm struggling to find employees with the skills that they need to fill the jobs that we have work there to do to make our educational system more relevant to employers and to prospective employees. in this state. In summation, I just want to ask you for your support. I hope that when you go into the voting place this November, that you will look at the candidates and ask a basic question. Which one of us is best prepared to be the next governor of this state? Which one of us has made the hard decisions, has had the business experience, the farming experience, the policy-making experience, military experience, parenting experience that I think is necessary to prepare you to be a good governor? I have had those experiences. My opponent has not, and those are big differences I hope you will all carefully consider. Thank you all very much.
Roland and all the WIBA members, thank you very much. As many of you know, I do come from the Graves Truck Line family, and let me take a minute to talk a little bit about that. In 1935, my grandfather lost the farm during the Depression, and what he had to work with at that time was 10 children and one old truck, and started hauling farm to market. And I say that because Graves Truck Line, although they were successful certainly in the late 60s and 70s, wasn't a large business. It was a small business. And I've often wondered what it must have felt like in 1935 to wake up one morning without your farm and probably no government program to bail you out. It was a case of using initiative, hard work, and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. So Graves Truck Line was an experience that I've had all my life. And it's true that by the time I was involved in the company in the 60s and 70s, that it had already matured to the point that I didn't have to borrow money on behalf of the business. But I can assure you, from the time I was old enough to work, I was involved in sweeping trailers. As a matter of fact, Dad often says the best training I ever got for state government was when I used to sweep the back of the cattle trailers out. He thought there was some connection there with state government, which goes to show you a little bit about what my family thought of that. But I say that because we started out, you work in the trailers, you work on the dock. I traveled the network of the 42 terminals we had and did some work there, and I worked in the front office, and I certainly understand business. And although I was not raised or born on a farm, when my father sold that business in the late 70s when I was away at graduate school, he bought a farm, and he farms north of Salina up around Bennington. I have a part ownership in that. That doesn't make me a farmer. I'm not a trucker, I'm not a farmer. I'm in the business of state government. For the last 8 years, I've been involved on a day-to-day basis working for you. Many of you have interacted with our corporate division. Some of you have interacted with our Uniform Commercial Code division. We've worked very hard to bring a sense of professionalism and personal attention in the operation of that agency that I think all citizens of this state want to see, but I think especially people who are involved in business want to see. And it's the same kind of attention and leadership that I want to bring to the governor's office, because as I said in my opening statement, we have a problem with spending in this state. We have got to figure out a way to take $7.2 billion and make it work better for all of us. And I believe my experience over the last 8 years well prepares me to do that. Now, it is true I do not have legislative experience. I think I have an experience that's better than that. I've spent the last 8 years making decisions about how that agency runs. And once those decisions are made, we sit down, we plan, we implement, we execute, and we deliver on behalf of the people of Kansas. And I know that the high and tight slogans to some of you probably sounds like just a political slogan, but it is really true that it's something I grew up with, but it's also an interesting phenomena of this year's campaign. That theme has really taken hold with many, many Kansans, because I think it truly reflects what they are ready to see from state government. We aren't in a position where we can look anywhere else to help solve our problems. We can't look to Washington. We can't pass on our burdens to cities and counties. We've got to live within our means, and I think I have an excellent track record of having done that. Having said that, I selected for my running mate one of the finest state legislators in Kansas, Sheila Fromm from Colby, the Senate Majority Leader, the first woman to ever hold that position, someone that does have a strong agricultural background as a fourth-generation Kansas farmer, someone who served on a local school board, on the State Board of Education, and now has the legislative experience that I think balances my executive branch, business background, experience with her experience. So we think we bring a ticket to the voters of Kansas that will serve well the very diverse nature of the problems that we have. And clearly it is time in Kansas to start healing the wounds, start building the consensus between eastern Kansas and western Kansas, between urban and rural. I think that the governor's race in 1994 is one of the most important defining moments that we've come to in many, many years, because we're going to be selecting the leadership that propels us forward for the next 4 years, who deals with the tough problems of state finances, who takes care of military pensions, who comes up with the money to fund SRS programs, who tries to figure out a way creatively to deal with prison overcrowding without breaking the backs of taxpayers. There's an entire litany of very serious, difficult issues to work with, and the governor alone won't solve those problems. The solution is, who do you look to build your team? Who is your cabinet? What kind of quality people can you attract? And I will submit to you, as a demonstration of that ability, review the record of my running mate, someone that I'm extremely pleased to have on board and supporting me in the Graves-Fromm ticket. I encourage all of you to stay actively involved over the next 5 weeks. I encourage you to get your family and your employees, your friends to go and vote, and I will suggest to you that irrespective of your choice on that date, that you go out and vote, because it is critical. We will have an impact on the future of your personal and your professional lives. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. As being one of those lobbyists in Topeka, I can assure you, whichever one of you gets elected, I will be knocking on your door. We have a number of very serious things that we are concerned about, and we appreciate very deeply you taking the time to come and discuss the things that we had time for tonight. It's greatly appreciated, and you did it professionally, and we appreciate it very much. And I'd like to thank the panel up here who had to read my scripts that we worked on and reworked, and all the questions that everyone put together, and the timing went quite well. Now, following this forum, the candidates are invited to go to a press room in 101 and 102 to meet with the press, so that the press has additional questions they would like to ask them. They will have that opportunity. And for you in the audience, I'd like to thank you for coming. We appreciate it very much, and good night.
Thank you, Roland.
Kansas voters go to the polls on November 8th. This debate was sponsored by the Wichita Independent Business Association. This Sunday on Campaign Almanac, we follow the race for governor in Iowa between incumbent Republican Terry Branstad and Democratic challenger